And welcome to another episode of Drag Illustrated's The Racing Business. Thank you for joining us for another week. This week is the World Series of Pro Mod Week. So happy Monday of World Series of Pro Mod Week. This week we have a very cool guest. We have Brett Underwood, who works with Drag Illustrated. I'm assuming the title is Director of Sales, but we'll figure that out when we speak with Brett. But Brett is the person who creates and cultivates a lot of the partnerships that you see both in the magazine, at the different events, and keeps the train moving here. But not just that, not just going to tell us how he does those things here at Drag Illustrated, but also just has a super long history just in the sport and in business in general. And so this is really going to be a gem of an episode for you to just hear about all the different things that Brett's done in the past and the advice that he's given. Really is one of the OGs of the industry here. So for this week, want to bring on our guest, Brett Underwood. Brett, how you doing today, brother?
Good. How are you guys today?
I'm doing good.
Hope all is going well.
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. So tell us a little bit all about all of what's going on in the world of Brett Underwood, and then also for Drag Illustrated, for the people out there who want to know. And it's a big week this week. This is airing Monday, so there's this big week this week of the World Series of Pro Mod.
We're really looking forward to our race this weekend. We've got a lot going on in Bradenton, Florida. I think it's going to be a very good week for all of us. The magazine's been going very well. Knock on wood, its business has been good. Had a really good winter, and really looking forward to the race this weekend.
Yeah. So what are some of all the different ways that people can get involved in Drag Illustrated? Because now there's, it's not just a magazine, it's magazines, events. Wes has a huge social presence. There's shows like the Wes Buck Show and this show here. Like, can you just tell the viewers just some of the ways that they can get involved?
A lot of different ways to get involved with us over the different platforms we have. Of course, we have Drag Illustrated magazine, which is basically our breadwinner, as you would say. We have our different events. We have some different programs that we've put together over the years. One that we do is very popular is our 30 Under 30 program that we do at the PRI trade show every December in Indianapolis. What we do is we pick 30 kids that are under 30 years old. Doesn't have to be a racer, doesn't have to be a crew guy, can be a PR person, can be a photographer, can be just about anything in our sport. And this past year, we had over 7,000 nominations. To pick 30 out of that was a pretty tough pick.
Yeah, you guys did a really good job of putting together, lots of promos, and the prize package caused quite a commotion. I know people had a hard time, not necessarily a hard time, but it caused some things with people getting home with all the prizes that they won.
Yeah, I went to 15 different sponsors this past year, and I probably have had another 5 or 10 want to get involved with us this year. So it'll be interesting. A lot of people gave product. A lot of people gave gift certificates. We had Lincoln Electric award a welder and a welding school to one winner out of the 30. Cornwell Tools, quite a few other different companies gave product, hats. We had a nitrous company that gave us nitrous bottles.
Whole bottle.
It was kind of tough for the kids to get all their stuff home, but somehow they managed.
That's awesome. And so lots of different ways for people to get involved with the different things happening here at Drag Illustrated. So so that's where you are now. One of the things that I love about the sport is, we want to go back and we want to know the full story of Brett Underwood and how you got to where you are today. And then also what you learned along the way, and some of the things that you can give the audience here as far as advice. So tell us, where does the Brett Underwood story begin?
It began in East Peoria, Illinois. My parents owned a motorcycle shop for probably 25, 30 years. We all grew up in the motorcycle industry. We had 5 kids in our family. I had 2 older brothers, 2 younger sisters. We all rode bikes since we were 4 and 5 years old. So I grew up in the motorcycle industry. We all raced motorcycles, did very well at that. A lot of the professional motorcycle racers stayed at my dad's shop when I was a kid. So we got to travel early on and go out on the road with different racers over the years. And a lot of those guys used my dad's shop as kind of a pit area for the Midwest Nationals. Our hometown of Peoria, Illinois, it has the oldest running dirt track national event on the AMA motorcycle racing tour. It's called the Peoria TT. Quite a few of the guys come back from the Northwest, from California. A lot of those guys stayed at my dad's shop. I end up going to the West Coast, traveling with quite a few of those guys. End up meeting a gentleman by the name of Neil Britt. Later on, he used to run National Dragster with IHRA. He offered me my first job back in 1984 and asked me what I was going to do that winter. I said, I'm going to go back to Peoria and freeze my butt off. I don't stay out here. And I said, what am I going to do? Live at the beach? And he said, no. He said, have you ever sold advertising? I said, no, but I said, I'm a people person. I like people. I can get in an elevator with 9 people and get out no 8 of them. So make a long story short, I did that. And here I am 40 years later. Had some very good stops along the road.
Well, let's if you don't mind, let's slow down and sort of go stop by stop or floor by floor if we're in an elevator. So the first stop, tell us a little bit more about the family business back in Peoria and some of the things that you learned growing up in that environment. And also you said you're a people person. Like, is that something that came from family? Were you just born with it, or something that you developed?
One thing I learned early on from my dad and my mom is my dad used to beat into us that service was everything. And I think that's helped me along my 40-year career, is if I tell somebody I'm going to do something, 99 times out of 100, I do it. There's a time, every now and then something will fall between the cracks. But when we owned our motorcycle shop, all my buddies would be going to the Cub or Cardinal games in the summertime while we were working in our motorcycle shop, which I'm glad now. We used to think my dad was a slave driver, but at the end of the day, I can work with these 2 hands and fix stuff. And if my plumbing breaks, I crawl into the sink and fix it. If my car breaks, I can fix it. We can work on motorcycles. So I'm very fortunate to learn early on that service is everything. He used to tell us, when someone comes in, get up, wash your hands off, ask the people, can I help you? Not what do you want? What do you need? Can I help you? And my dad used to say, hey, try to sell them something, whether it was a motorcycle, a quart of oil, a light bulb, something. And I learned early on that, service was more important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it sounds like also and listening too, like getting into relationship with people by listening to, well, one, asking them, what do they want? Like, how can I help you? And then also listening.
Yes. I learned a long time ago, communication is very important. And follow-up is probably the second most important thing. A lot of people communicate, but a lot of people don't follow up. And one thing I've learned over the years that I don't think a lot of these younger people have learned, this is a relationship-driven business. That, you make relationships along the road of life. I've had companies that have helped me for 40 years. And, I can pick up the phone and call them, and pretty much instantly they'll help us. So on wood, I learned early on that this is a relationship driven business.
Gotcha. So tell us a little bit, some stories about just growing up so close to the track there in Peoria, and how your family was able to, turn both that into a business. But what did you learn? What did you learn there at the track at an early age?
Learned early on, teamwork is very important, especially in motorcycle racing. The rider, of course, is very important, but you got to have the equipment. We were fortunate enough. I had 2 older brothers that both raced, did very well. We always had good equipment because we all worked together at it. My dad, my 2 brothers, myself, my 2 little sisters. We worked with a lot of teams over the years, professional motorcycle racers that would come and stay at my dad's shop. We end up winning the Peoria TT probably 5 or 6 times with different teams. Was very important lesson we learned early on is teamwork. Not one person can do it. You got to have a good team around you, whether it's people, whether it's equipment, whether it's sponsors. Learned early on a lot of the factory teams, Kenny Roberts, Jay Springsteen, Steve Eklund, a lot of the big name motorcycle racers would stay at my dad's shop early on, and learned a lot from those guys as well.
Great. Tell us a little bit about just being in a family business too. A lot of our listeners are parts of family business, and a lot of the guests that we've had so far were in family businesses. So just, what did you learn about there, or what type of advice do you have with people in family businesses?
One thing we learned early on, my dad used to say, it didn't matter whose job it was, just get it done. That he never wanted to hear, that's not my job. One good thing, between learning from my two older brothers as well as my dad, we learned as we got a little bit older, and we got to do more things. We got to travel as we got older, got to go with the different riders, to the different national events around the country. And as we got older and learned more and, learned the business, I thought it was good for everybody as far as, learning the parts business, learning the mechanics of the motorcycle shop, learning how to sell things. It was good to learn different aspects of the business.
Gotcha. And so now we're at the point in the story where it sounds like you end up at National Dragster out in California. Well, first of all, before that happened, how did that relationship get built? Get built to the point where someone just asked you, like, "Hey, look, we got it. Like, no interview, you got the job. Like, will you be here?" Like,
A gentleman by the name of Steve Eklund, who we won #1 with in 1979. We were at Ascot Park in California. Ended up doing real well. We were in the winner circle, ended up meeting some people who introduced me to some people. And I made a couple phone calls and went up and interviewed for the job at Dragster. Drove back to Peoria, Illinois, ended up buying a brand new car, put as much stuff as I could in the back seat, and drove back to California. And here I am 40 years later. So
gotcha.
it's been an interesting ride.
Yeah. So you said that was what year did you start at Dragster?
1984.
Okay. So tell us just about the, a lot of people here either, either weren't born or weren't fans yet, or may not remember exactly what it was, but like one of the first guests for the racing business here was Colbert Seagraves, Ralph Seagraves' son. And he was telling us just about the different landscapes and a extremely awesome history lesson of Winston and RJR as a sponsor and the history of NHRA. But just for our listeners, can you tell us about the landscape of National Dragster, NHRA, drag racing, just entertainment in 1984? Like, what did you step into?
1984 was an interesting time. There was a lot of teams, a lot of big name sponsors out there. We still had all the beer companies. Just a very, very good time. A lot of great racers. Ended up staying there only for about a year and a half. The gentleman that I worked for, Neil Britt, basically came to me one day and said, hey, he had come from Peterson Publishing Company and got a call and said they were looking for a salesman over there to run a magazine called Drag Racing Magazine. And he came into me and said, hey, he was in his 40s at the time. He said, I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. You're not going to get my job. There's only so much you can grow in this company. You might want to think about that. So I ended up going and meeting with the people over there and ended up going to Peterson Publishing Company, which was Hot Rod Magazine, and worked there for probably 7 years, and ended up going to the SEMA show in Las Vegas and ended up meeting Billy Meyer, who had built the Texas Motorplex in Texas. Yep. And he came to me and said, hey, he had just bought IHRA, the International Hot Rod Association, and he was looking for an advertising salesman to run his magazine. And cool. I laughed. I said, I only have 2 questions. Number 1, how much? And number 2, do I have to live in Waco, Texas?
Well, let's go back to, and also let's do some dates too, so that we have some like chronology to this. So National Dragster was for about a year there, and that was your first sales job, ad sales job. What did you learn there, and what's evolved over time? Like what are some less
at that time, because National Dragster at that time was 48 weeks a year. It was still a newspaper, wasn't a slick magazine like it is today. It was 48 times a year. It was every week. And it was an interesting time back then because you had to fill up 48 newspapers. I learned a lot about printing. We ended up going to the printer every week. We had to proof ads. We saw how the thing was printed. We saw how it was put together. The sales team basically every week had to go to the printer, had to check on all the ads. make sure everything was right, everything was positioned right. And so it was a learning experience for me, learning how, the publication business was.
Yeah. Well, tell us too, because I mean, some of the people listening either, started later in the world's evolution, and or if they, were working in 1984, probably just completely forgot. But like National Dragster, like, and just the NHRA at that point, like I know that it was national, but how much national reach did it have, or was drag racing still sort of, a little bit like segmented at that point? And also, if it was national, which I do remember it was, like what was doing business like in 1984 for a magazine, right? Like it's like now we just, we pick this thing up and send an ad immediately, like AI creates the ad and we send it. But like, tell us what putting together a magazine in 1984 was like.
It was different times. It was really before cell phones as we know it today. Everything was done by phone. Basically, we got on the phone after the events every Monday, tried to sell win ads. Win ads were a lot more important back in those days. We had Budweiser, we had Miller, we had Old Milwaukee Beer, we had, Castrol, we had Kindle. We had a lot of the big major companies out there. So when they would win a race or do well on the weekend, we had RJ Reynolds Tobacco Company, who was a very big advertiser at that time as the series sponsor. So it just a whole lot different than it is today.
Yeah. Well, and how about just the technicalities of it, right? Like how did you get graphics at that point? Like how were the ads designed? Like how did you proof the designs?
We built a lot of the ads ourselves in house back then. And what was interesting about those days was I tell people back in those days there was 150 companies to sell an ad to. Well, as evolution's gone on, today we probably have 10 companies that own 15 companies. You understand what I'm saying?
Right, right.
Back in those days, you had Crane Cams, Comp Cams, MSD Ignition, go on down the list, and everybody was a separate organization, a separate company. Whereas now, a lot of big companies have bought up a lot of small companies. So it's just not as many companies to sell ads to today as there was back in 1984.
Right. And so you guys would design the ad. Like what was the proofing like how did the other people on the other side even get to see the ad before? Like were there even ways that you could
We drew it up, we'd fax it to them.
fax? That's
Yep.
right. Fax. I forgot.
Yep.
Okay.
Fax
Faxing.
back in those days. Um, that's basically how everything was done. We draw it up. We draw up win ads. They, tell us, hey, we had everything in house as far as decals and, most people's major sponsor logos and stuff like that. And we kind of, it was the old yellow tablet deal, you know, we draw it out on a yellow tablet and, they tell us kind of what they wanted to, how they wanted to see it. We draw it up and away we'd go.
Nice. That's awesome. Yeah, thanks for sharing that. And so then from there the next move was Peterson, you said, yeah?
Yes, I went to work for Peterson Publishing Company. My editor's name was Dave Wallace, worked for a gentleman by the name of Lee Kelly. And Lee ran what was called Specialty Publications at the time and had a very good run there. And then in 1987, 88 is when I went back to the SEMA show. And Billy Meyer offered me a job to go to Texas to run IHRA's magazine, which was called Drag Review. And I laughed at him, basically said he didn't have enough money for me to move from Los Angeles to Waco, Texas. Well,
So yeah, so
he
but
did.
before we get to the IHRA, but you did end up taking that job, right?
Yes.
Was it in Waco or were you able to do it from California?
No, he made me move to Texas.
Made you move to Texas.
So
Gotcha. So tell us about the Peterson Publishing.
Peterson Publishing Company was a very interesting time. Worked with a lot of the big books, Hot Rod, Carcraft, Motor Trend back in those days. Very, very powerful, probably the most powerful organization in printing at that time. As far as the motorsports world, they owned probably, I don't know, 30, 40 magazines and just a very powerful time, very big company to work for back in those days. They had all the power. They had all the best writers, the best photographers. Very powerful organization owned by one man, Robert E. Peterson.
Gotcha. And how were you said that a lot of when you were at National Dragster, a lot of the ads were more driven by race on the weekend and then sell those ads on Monday. What was the cycle of advertising for the bigger books, or not the bigger books, but the different books?
Mainly, we didn't do as many win ads over there at Drag Racing magazine, but a lot of it had to do with the hard parts. And I was fortunate enough to make a lot of friends in the bigger world, as I call it: Budweiser, Miller, Castrol, Kendall, Winston. I carried a lot of the big blue chip accounts, and that's kind of where I got my start as far as dealing with bigger companies.
Mm-hmm. And what sort of advice did you learn, or lessons that you learned at Peterson that's still relevant today for some of the listeners?
If you're going to tell somebody you're going to do something, make sure you do it. Is my best advice.
Yeah.
That, a lot of times, they'd say, hey, this is what we want. This is what we want it to look like. This is where we want our ad to be. You needed to make sure that you took care of the people, especially the big accounts, the Winstons of the world. They wanted the back cover, the inside front cover, the center spread. You had to make sure that, you did them right.
Right. Well, in some case, with places like Winston, Colbert was telling some of the start, you also have to understand their business too, because it's like that was all of their marketing. Like that's all they could do. So they needed,
Yep.
that needed
Yep.
to be right.
Yep.
Yeah.
It was times back in those days.
Yeah. So one of our guests also last season was Chrissy Meyer from the Texas Motorplex. So tell us about the years at IHRA at their magazine and with Mr. Billy Meyer.
Was when I went to Waco, Texas. I was the first one to town and basically the last one to leave. When we got there, we were putting together the building. Ended up meeting one of Billy's best friends, a gentleman by the name of David Goss, and he was putting in electrical outlets, hanging lights, doing this, doing that. And Billy came in and said, hey, go pick your office. So, of course, I picked the biggest office, and Billy said, you can't have that office. That's mine. You can have the one next to me. So I ended up getting the office next to Billy, end up meeting this gentleman by the name of David Goss, who had grown up with Billy. That night, they were just getting ready to leave. It was 4:30, 5 o'clock. And David said to me, what are you doing tonight? And I said, I'm going back to my hotel probably, and, walk next door to Whataburger and have a burger in Waco, Texas. He said, no, you're coming to my house and have dinner at my house. At that time, he had two small daughters, 1 and 2 years old. And I've watched his daughters grow up over the years, went back for both their weddings. And so it's been very interesting. I met Christy when she was probably 2 or 3 years old, and always played with Christy as a little kid. And it's an interesting story. One time I ended up flying a girl that I dated in California to Texas, and Christy wouldn't talk to me. She started crying and thought I had deserted her as a 3-year-old. We tell that story, and it's interesting, to see Chrissy all grown up and now running the racetrack for her dad. So that was an interesting time. We ended up having 12 races that year with IHRA and ended up getting rained out at 10 of them.
Oh,
so it was a brutal year, to say the least.
Yeah.
And basically at the end of the year, Billy and his dad basically said, pull the plug, we're done. And I ended up staying on there. I ended up staying in Texas until 1993, and basically went back to the SEMA show, got another job, and stayed there ended up going to work for Bob Guccione that owned Penthouse Magazine. He had 3 car racing magazines, and ended up going to work for him. He had Stock Car, Open Wheel, and Super Stock Magazine, and ended up running those for him for years.
Okay. What did you do in the years in Waco after the IHRA? Did you still stay and work with the track, or did you just do other?
That it was a place called General Media, and that was out of New York City, and he had 3 car racing books, and ended up traveling, going to the drag races still, and going to a lot of NASCAR races. A gentleman by the name of Dick Berggren, who was the editor at Stock Car Racing Magazine. A lot of people know him through CBS and being an announcer. He was my editor there, and ended up having a real good relationship with him. and met a lot of the drivers and stuff in NASCAR that I'm still good friends with living here in Charlotte today.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about, because this tends to be a stop for a lot of people in motorsports of not wanting to take a job because it's like, oh, the job may disappear, or people who are, they're living their best life and then the job disappears, and they sort of feel like everything is over. Like, can you put us just in the mindset that you were in when when sort of the I wouldn't necessarily say the IHRA implosion, but like, you get halfway into the year and realize that half the races have been, or more than half the races have been rained out, and that at the end of the year your job may be gone. Like, what sort of mode do you get into? Like, what sort of advice do you have for people that that do it? Because that's something that happens a lot in racing.
I would say don't ever give up. In fact, what was interesting is Billy called me in one day at the, when they had made the decision not to go on, and he kind of felt responsible for me moving from Los Angeles to Waco, Texas, and said, "Hey, you know, I kind of feel responsible for you wanting to be, you being here." And so he ended up paying my way back to the SEMA show in Las Vegas and ended up meeting the people for my next job, and was very fortunate that I knew a lot of people in the industry. And so I've never really had a job, I've had the rug pulled out from underneath me a few times, but knock on wood, I've been able to land on my feet every time. So knock on wood, it's been good over the years.
You're a squirrel. You're always going to land on your feet.
So
Well,
now
tell
I
us
have
some of the lessons that you learned
9 lives.
business. You got 9 lives too. 9 live squirrel. He's a cat squirrel. He's a cat
Exactly.
squirrel. Well, tell us some of the lessons that you learned at the IHRA magazine before we move on to the Dick Berggren and the.
With IHRA, it was an interesting time because at that time, um, I would say that IHRA really had a better sportsman program than NHRA back in those days. Had a lot more cars, and basically what killed us was weather. I mean, we went to every race. We had our own airplane. Billy had a Learjet that we flew to the races on. And, when you get there and you start up the race, and the next thing you know, you get rain for 2 or 3 days, there was really nothing we could do. And the neat part about the IHRA days is everybody that ran the NHRA side, Bernstein, Coletta, Gary Ormsby, Candies and Hughes, a lot of those big teams that ran on the NHRA side, they came over and tried to help us on the NHRA side because Billy was an ex-funny car racer and was good friends with all of them. So it wasn't like we didn't have big name cars. We had all the big names of the sport. It's just we got burned by weather.
Gotcha.
So,
And so then the next move was to the different public.
Worked there for like 5 or 6 years. Everything was good, and then one day they woke up and decided that all salespeople need to live in New York City, and said that's not going to happen. And I kind of liked living in Texas at the time. Was an independent contractor, and so again, I went back to the SEMA show in Las Vegas and meeting some people here in Charlotte. They end up moving me here to Charlotte, gentleman by the name of Robert Griggs. He owned 2 publications, one called Winston Cup Scene and another one called Winston Cup Illustrated, and ended up moving me here to Charlotte and worked for him for a lot of years. And everything went well there. Ended up learning the NASCAR business. Went to a lot of the races.
What year was that? What years were that?
I'm
Those
here at 93.
93.
1993.
Yeah.
And worked for him for a few years, and everything kind of went well there. And then all of a sudden, he ended up selling out again to American Business City Journals in Charlotte. And that's when they said I lived up at Lake Norman here, and they wanted me to drive to Charlotte every day and drive a desk. And I decided I didn't want to drive a desk. So that's when I ended up jumping out of the advertising world. Ended up having a friend of mine by the name of Dick Nelson. He ended up running a company called Revell. Most people know what Revell plastic model cars are. He ended up taking the division out of Chicago and ended up bringing the division down here and ended up building a diecast division called Revell Monogram, which was diecast cars to replicate what they had in plastic model cars. Ended up going to work for him. he asked me one day, he said, "Have you ever done any licensing?" I said, "No." "What's it entail?" He said, "Making deals with different teams, stuff like that." So I said, "Sure, I'd love to try it." Ended up working for him for a few years. Again, the company got sold.
Well, what years you're gonna have to continue to tell me what years, because at some point we probably interacted and didn't even know that we interacted. But what years were was that at Revell?
The Revell deal was probably 96, 97. Yeah, 96, 97. And the company ended up getting bought by Action Performance.
Action, yeah.
And I know you worked at NASCAR at the time, I think. And I got a phone call. In fact, it was the last day of our job before they closed the doors. And at first, I thought it was a joke. It was the people from Mattel Toy Company in California wanting to know. They were looking for a licensing person. So I ended up saying, "Hey, can you call me back in an hour?" They ended up calling me at home, and ended up doing the licensing for Mattel Toy Company and the Hot Wheels brand.
Very, very neat. So tell us a little bit about the Revell days, because I mean, people my age remember the just explosion of NASCAR, well, specifically NASCAR diecast. I guess there was also on the drag racing side, but on the NASCAR side, it just had like it just exploded, and like everyone was a part of it. Like the diecast companies were entrepreneurs in it, the racers themselves were entrepreneurs, the teams were entrepreneurs, the
It's
sanctioning body
very,
had.
very interesting time in the licensing world. We made deals with a lot of the teams. Um, there was a lot of the teams we couldn't deal with. Earnhardt was one of them because he was tied up with Action Performance, but they were so busy doing their day-to-day stuff that we ended up getting to make a lot of the one-off programs, like when they run special paint schemes, like here at the Charlotte, at the Winston. We
Mhm.
ended up the Wheaties program. We did the red, white, and blue cars that Dale ran. We ended up doing the yellow and black uh, Corvettes that him and Junior drove when they went over to Japan. We did a lot of those cars, so we got to do a lot of interesting things. One thing I learned through that deal is how valuable some of the diecast were. For example, we did a lot of stuff with RJ Reynolds. We did a lot of the Winston cars for T. Wayne Robertson there at RJR, and it was amazing what people would pay. And we did limited runs on all the high dollar stuff. My boss was smart. He said, "I'd rather build 5,000 and sell out instead of doing 50,000 and having 20,000 sitting on the shelf."
Right.
So it was very collectible in those days when I was there. I mean, I had friends of mine that would wait in line at the big box stores, when the boxes would show up, and they'd make a deal with a manager and rummage through and take all the good cars out of there.
Yeah, that's amazing. Any drag racing connection during those times, or were drag race you guys
We
didn't get involved?
NHRA, and in fact, right before Revell got stopped, we had met with them in IndyCar both. In fact, I went to St. Petersburg, Florida for the first IndyCar race and met with them, and we were going to end up making IndyCars. And then everything, in fact, we had the molds done for drag racing and ended up not getting to do it. And that was when I had the opportunity. When I went to work for Mattel, we had a lot of the new cars done. My boss was real good at getting stuff done over in China with the factories. And we had a lot of the new cars done as far as the molds. And he took a registered letter and handed it to me and asked me to give it to the executives at Mattel when I went out there. And we ended up doing some stuff. We ended up selling a lot of the molds, I think, to Mattel
Gotcha,
back in the day. So,
gotcha. So then you ended up at Mattel.
yep,
So
yep.
tell us about those days.
Those were interesting days too. It was fun. Just it got to the point where diecast was, when I was with Revell, I would say it was at its peak. And the next few years, the diecast market as we know it today kind of got flooded. Walmart, Kmart, all the big vendors, the big Targets of the world, they got overstocked, had thousands upon thousands of cars they couldn't give away. And the diecast market as we knew it was dying. and I kind of looked to do something else. And that was when some other friends approached me about getting back into the advertising business.
Well,
And
actually, just really quickly, that's interesting because I never really knew what happened in the diecast market, but that totally makes sense that the big box stores just decided that they
well,
needed
the
mass
market got
quantity.
is what happened
Right.
is, some vendors, instead of making 5 and 10,000 car runs, they'd make 100,000 car runs and just stuff them down, Walmart, Kmart, Target's throat. And at the end of the day, they couldn't sell them. And, from then on, the diecast market just kind of nosed over and died. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
it's still going today, but it's not near what it was back in those days.
Yeah, I remember some of the days that in my NASCAR days where it's like you would just we didn't necessarily do it, but you would, like in a media day or something like that, you'd walk into a room and it'd just be thousands of die casts and the driver just literally just walking around the room signing stuff, and you're like, oh,
Yeah.
this is the
Yeah.
the life they don't show on TV.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to be good friends with Neil Bonnet and Dale Earnhardt, and we go up to Dale's shop, and that's exactly what you saw. They had a room that had probably 8, 9, 10-foot tables, and they was probably, I don't know, 30, 40 feet long in this big room, and they put all this merchandise up on these tables, and Dale had to sign merchandise almost every day or he'd get behind,
Yeah.
whether it was 20,000 die-cast cars, hats, jackets, photographs. Was fortunate enough to get to know him, pretty well over the years. Him and Neil Bonnet both.
Yeah, that's awesome. I grew up watching racers. Neil,
Oh,
Neil Bonnet show on I guess TNT. Golly, that was a good show.
yeah, very interesting
Yeah.
story. In fact, Neil Bonnet,
Man.
I was with Neil at Pomona, California, for the Winter Nationals, and some friends of mine out there had an alcohol funny car and asked me, said, "Hey, we'd like to ask you a favor." And I said, "What do you want?" And I was out there with Neil, and he said, "Do you think Neil would come over and put on one of our shirts and take a picture?" I said, "I'm sure he would." So I went and got him, and sure, sure, he went over and drank a beer with him, put on the shirt. We ended up, 2 weeks later, I saw him at Daytona, and ended up going to the hospital the day that he got killed. So it
Oh
was a
wow.
sad day.
Yeah, I'm sorry, but it was sad day. Sad. Yeah, yeah. That was not a.
I
Yeah,
remember going out to a place called Spruce Creek where Earnhardt had a house where they all stayed. And I ended up going and packing Neil's clothes for his wife, Susan, that night, and ended up coming back and meeting her at her hotel and gave her Neil's clothes. And it was a sad day.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Man, I mean, yeah. Thanks for sharing that story. But I remember that day too. I wasn't in the industry yet, but I remember that day. Remember that day as a fan. Um,
Yep. Tough
yeah,
day.
yeah, yeah. Well, so and where are we in the story, man? Where were you working at this point of the story? Where
When the Mattel deal ended up
Mattel?
going
There we go.
Mattel south, I got a phone call from a friend of mine, and he said, "You need to call a gentleman in New York by the name of Stanley Harris." Stanley Harris owned a company called Harris Publications, ended up owning 93 magazines. And I never called the guy. And my buddy called me about a week later and said, "Hey, you didn't call my guy." I said, "How do you know?" He said, "Because I talked to him and he said, you call and you didn't call him." Well, I didn't think the guy would pay me. So I ended up calling the guy, and it ended up being probably one of the best deals I've ever had. Got in an airplane, flew up to New York, met with him. Basically, he asked me why he should hire me. And I basically told him that I was aggressive, that, you know, I would make sure he made tons of money, but he was going to have to pay me tons of money. And he said he was used to paying 15%. And I told him I'm used to getting 20%. And he said, "Why do I want to pay you 20% when I pay everybody else 15%? And I said, "Because you don't have a guy that could carry my briefcase." And like that, he said, "Oh, you're cocky." I said, "No, just sure of myself, and fortunate, got a lot of good contacts over the years." So he ended up shaking hands with me and said, "Hey, tell you what, let's do. Let's do a 90-day deal. See if you like us. See if we like you. You might not like us. We might not like you." So the first issue out, it was a magazine called Mopar Action. And I busted my butt, got on the phone, called in a lot of favors, ended up selling almost $40,000 more in the first issue than the guy before me had ever sold.
Oh, wow.
And our CFO ended up calling me and said, hey, I don't think we have to worry about that 90-day deal. End up working with him for almost 20 years.
Oh, wow.
And very interesting time. We had 2 magazines at the time, Mopar Action and Mopar Now. In 2008, when things got tough in the industry, basically a lot of people said, we want to be in your big book, which was Mopar Action. And a lot of people bailed out of the smaller book called Mopar Now, which was all about the new modern stuff. And so every time I would talk to Dennis, my advertising guy in New York, or the owner, it was doom and gloom about how much money he wasn't making, how much money this magazine was costing him. So one Friday afternoon, when I was talking to Dennis, he was going on about how this thing was a pain. And so I told him, I said, Dennis, stick a knife in this thing's neck. I said, every time I talk to you, it's doom and gloom. So he talked to Stanley that night. Stanley was kind of a strange person that he'd come in at 10 or 11 o'clock in the morning, but he'd work till 10 or 11 o'clock at night. So we did most of our business at night on the telephone. So he called me about 9:30, 10 o'clock one night, and he said, hey, Dennis told me you want to kill Mopar Now. I said, Stanley, I said, you're not making any money. I'm not making any money. Every time I talk to you, you say it's costing you money. Dennis tells me it's costing you money. Let's get rid of it. So we end up killing the magazine. A couple weeks later, I called Stanley and said, Stanley, we need to do a drag racing magazine. He laughed, and this was 2008, of course, so times were tough. He said, Brett, he said, we don't need to do a drag racing. I got enough magazines now. I said, Stanley, 2 magazines had gone under in the last year or so. So I told him, I said, hey, we need to do a drag racing magazine. So about 2 weeks later, he called me again, 10 o'clock at night, said, were you serious about that? I said, yeah. He said, how much do you think we can put in the first issue? I said, $50,000 worth of advertising. He laughed. He said, there's no way you're going to put $50,000 in a startup magazine. I ended up putting $71,000 in the first. So make a long story short, me and a gentleman by the name of John DeBartolomeo and another guy by the name of John Asher, we all worked together on that and ran that for probably 15 to almost 20 years. Did very well, was fortunate. And then one day again, the phone rings, and there used to be 3 or 4 distributors in America that distributed magazines out at the newsstand. And now there was only 2. They told Stanley he was going to pay 50% more to distribute his magazines. And he said he'd lock the door.
Yeah.
But paid that kind of money. And guess what? On Friday of that week, the meeting, I think, was on Monday afternoon. On Friday. So make a long story short, had the rug pulled out from me once again.
All right. And what was the name of the drag racing magazine that you did there?
We had Drag Racing Action and Mopar Action.
Okay, cool, very cool. Well, can you talk a little bit about the value conversation of you got into that business and just you knew your value going in and you worked your value in going in, but also talk a little bit about like I know a bunch of people where they shortchange themselves in the beginning just to get the job, and then a month in they realize they can't actually live on it, and it's like, well, you should have just stood your ground, because now you're an even bigger problem.
I've always been one I'd roll the dice. A lot of people like that guaranteed salary. And I always said, no, I'll take the 20% and run. And if I, sell $1 million, you got to pay me 200 grand. So make a long story short, a lot of people like that guaranteed salary. I'm fortunate. I'm single. I've never been married, so I don't have any kids. So I've kind of run with my hair on fire most of my life.
That's how I got. Be careful. That's how I got bald.
There you go. Cars and motorcycles and boats and jet skis all my life, and I've traveled my whole life, so I just never really did settle down. Dated a girl for 6.5 years at one time. She got killed in a car accident, and
sorry.
Just never ever settled down. So the thing I tell people is my job has kind of been my life. I mean, most of the people that I run with, that I have dinner with, that I eat lunch with, are either advertisers or people that I deal with in racing. So, when I get up and go down the hallway in the morning, I don't have to worry about traffic. The only thing I have to worry about is my two cats. So as long as Max and Jax aren't in the hallway, then I'll be good.
That's awesome. That's awesome. So where are we at in the story, and what was next?
After that, when Stanley folded the tent, basically, I want to say, I don't know what year it was, but it was probably 2015, maybe. I ended up having probably $150,000 worth of contracts on my desk signed, and I didn't want to have to give that money back because I knew I would never get it back again. So what I did is I sat down and I thought about who can I go to that could back me on a magazine, and I come up with 3 names. Jags, the 4 brothers had helped me for the last 35, 40 years, Summit Racing, and the third one was Lucas Oil Company. And I ended up going with Lucas Oil Company. A friend of mine by the name of Don Corset helped me put the deal together. And I went to Lucas because Lucas sponsored the Sportsman Drag Racing Series. And we wanted to be a part of, the Sportsman Racer. That's where you sell most of the parts to. And I had a lot of manufacturers that depended on the Sportsman Racer. So we did a lot of tech stories. My editor, John DeBartolomeo, was a great tech writer. And so we went with Lucas and ran it for probably 7 years with them. And that's kind of where I ended up my last job. And then one morning they woke up and decided they didn't want to be in the magazine business any longer. And I ended up talking with Wes and going up to Bristol a couple of years ago and said, "What are you going to do next year?" And I said, "I don't know." Why? And he said, "I need an advertising guy that can get up on the wheel." And I said, "Well, I'm going to be," he said, "We need to talk." I said, "I'll be in the car for 2 more hours. Start talking."
And I've also been up on the wheel for the past 40 years. So yeah, I can do that.
Yeah. So make a long story short, by the time I got to Bristol, I had the deal done, and away we went.
Started selling right away. So the Lucas deal, I love the short version of that, of putting all that together. What was the name of that magazine, or did you guys just keep one of the names of the magazines that were going?
I asked Stanley. Stanley didn't have a problem with me having Drag Racing Action, but the problem they had is they sold all the magazines to Parade Magazine. Even though they didn't continue on with it, they had the rights to it, so their attorneys wouldn't let us have it. So I renamed the magazine. We called it Drag Racing Edge.
Okay.
And come up with that. And John DeBartolomeo and myself, we ended up running it for probably 6 or 7 years and did very well with it. And until Lucas decided they didn't want to own a magazine anymore, and way we went.
Yeah, and so I mean, just talk about the how strong relationships have to be, where you essentially put yourself in a position where you got to choose between Jake Summit and Lucas, but also a situation where the advertisers whose contract that you had would be willing to go wherever you went.
It has to go back to, like I said on day one, this is a relationship driven business. And we've always made our living basically on tech stories and on editorial. And I go to people and say, "Hey, tell me about your new widget. You got a new axle, you got new brakes, you got this new that. Tell me about it. Let's go do a story about it." And so basically a lot of the manufacturers that I've dealt with for the last 25 or 30 years. Jeff Stange at Strange Engineering. He's helped me since day one. His dad, Bob Stange, owned the company before him. The Jags family, they've helped me for the last 40 years. Summit's helped me a lot of years. A lot of big companies, Castrol, Kendall, Budweiser, a lot of the big manufacturers that were out there, had great relationships with them. And knock on wood, I've been able to keep those relationships going.
Very awesome. Very awesome. Well, I guess just in this conversation off by, what's next for you? What's next for Drag Illustrated, and what's the what sort of ask do you have for the people listening?
I think we've got a lot of room to grow. I think the magazine keeps getting bigger and bigger. I think we have a lot of room to grow on our event side, putting on different events. That seems to have gone very well for us. Our big event this next week here, the World Series of Pro Mod. It'll be standing room only in Bradenton, Florida next weekend, March 1st, 2nd, and 3rd. I think we can grow there. Our 30 under 30 program's definitely going to grow this year, I think. Our internet, there's just many different ways. Grow with your show, for example. I think there's a lot of opportunities out there, especially on the digital side, that I think we can grow the business in.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for being I mean, we've known each other now for a couple of years, and but haven't had, I guess I haven't had an opportunity to have lunch or dinner with you, so I haven't got the whole full story. It's been an honor to get the whole full story, and helps build the relationship here, but also all the advice that you gave, super important to help our listeners out there and all the stuff that we do.
No, I'll say one thing. I've had a lot of people help me over the years, and I try to pass that forward. I've had some young kids come up to me in the past few years. I've always looked at it like this, that, I don't care who you are, you can learn something every day. I've learned, like I said, I've done this for 40 years. I've learned things in the last few years that I would never have thought that, there's better ways to do things, easier ways to do things. And I try to pay it forward when I can. I've had a lot of people help me over the years, so I try to help some of the young kids that are out there, and try to pass it forward if I can.
That's so awesome. Well, thank you so much for passing it forward by being a guest on this show and giving the advice that you did. And yeah, we look forward to seeing you this weekend over in Bradenton at the World Series of Pro Mod. And so thank you very much for being a guest on the show. And also, fans, want to thank you very much for being on the show with us this weekend and joining in for another show, helping to build your business and build your life and really preserve this great sport and lifestyle that we do love. Once again, we're brought to you by Racers Club. You can always go to racers.club. The site may be down this weekend, and if it is down, it's because all of our inventory is at Bradenton. So look forward to that, but it'll be right back up right after that. So actually go on right now and get your stuff before the site goes down for Bradenton. But either way, we'll be back here next week, and just thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week. Love you all.
Thank you.